Thank you. And a warm welcome also from me to our second panel on policy. And we're going to talk about creating responsible value. And we'll discuss policies and the possibilities of change in the fashion industry. Now, post-Rana Plaza, it has become clear that change needs to happen. We need change. And a lot of change is going on right now. So we'll talk about what is going on right now and ask also whether this is enough, what's happening right now. We'll hear from experts in the field, from different fields, and we'll hear about different ongoing initiatives. We'll hear from the experts about their own involvement in these different initiatives, and we'll discuss how and by whom further change can be achieved. Now, I'm tremendously happy to introduce the speakers of this panel. So if you hear your name, please come up to the stage, grab the microphone. First up is Vera Baumann, our representative from the government. Vera, please come to the floor. Any seat you like. Now, Vera has been in charge of communications on sustainable textiles in the German Sustainable Textile Partnership at the Ministry for Economic Cooperation and Development since 2016. And before that, she headed the Department for Economic Cooperation at the German Embassy in Tirana, so the capital of Albania, also a large textiles producing country. So maybe you can also talk about that, who knows? Great to have you here. Second up, we'll have Laura Ceresna-Chaturvedi. If you could please make up your way to the stage. Great. So Laura has lived in India and researched working conditions in both the garment and the electronics sector since 2010, and she's an NGO representative on our panel today because since July 2016 she's worked as an urgent appeals coordinator. Maybe you'll tell us more about what that role entails. Urgent Appeals Coordinator at Clean Clothes Campaign Germany, fighting for the empowerment of garment workers in production countries and taking action also on concrete cases of violations of the rights of these workers. Now, third, it's my pleasure to introduce Sarah Ditty. Sarah, great. Sarah Ditty represents another NGO. And Sarah is head of policy at Fashion Revolution, a global movement calling for a fairer, cleaner, and safer fashion industry. Sarah works to influence the public, the industry, policymakers, so basically all of us, on social and environmental issues across the sector, as well as leading the development of Fashion Revolution's annual Fashion Transparency Index. Maybe we'll hear more about that as well. Sarah is also a writer and speaker on sustainability issues in the fashion industry and has published in several major magazines and newspapers. Fourth, we have a representative from business, for the business sector. It's my pleasure to introduce Julien Labal. Julien is, since 2015, Chief Executive Officer at Edun, an eco-responsible fashion brand, and Julien works for all kinds of aspects of the business, including further developing Edun's global distribution in key international markets, managing production in Africa, and overseeing the design and production team in New York. So quite a number of tasks we'll probably hear a bit more about. He also works closely with Edun's founder, Ellie Hewson, who launched the brand in 2005. Last but not least, Doug Miller. I welcome you to the floor. Doug Miller is an academic. He's Emeritus Professor of the Design School at the University of Northumbria, UK, where he's done extensive work on labour rights in fashion. Between 2000 and 2008, he was Director of Research at the International Textile, Garment and Leather Workers Federation, now part of Industrial, the global union for manufacturing. During this period, he was responsible for research into supply chain developments, corporate social responsibility, and assisting the global union in its effort to negotiate international framework agreements with leading multinationals in the sector. In his academic post, Doug was responsible for agreements with leading multinationals in the sector, he was responsible for developing teaching and research strategy in the area of worker rights and fashion, also including a focus on living wages, on worker compensation, and on social labeling. Currently, he's active in an advisory capacity to the Dutch Fair Wear Foundation and the Action Collaboration Transformation Initiative. So we're very happy to have all of you here on the panel today. I'll take a seat. And to start with, I'd like to ask all of you to give maybe a short statement that situates yourself and the angle from which you want to address the problem we face, maybe in 1 or 2 minutes. Vera, maybe you want to start.
Yeah, thank you very much. I think that despite all the challenges, I think it is possible to shape global textile value chains in a sustainable way, also in the near future. And at the same time, I think we also have to be realistic. If we think, for example, of the EU organic food label, it needed about 30 years of rising consumer awareness before the ministries of the EU could actually sit together and decide upon it. So I think if we now want to change the global textile value chains, which are some of the most complex and long and diverse in the whole world, and they employ about 60 million people, I think we have to be prepared that we would have to think in maybe 20, 30 years, rather than in 1, 2, or 3. At the same time, I also think that the German government and Germany has a particular responsibility in that, because Germany is one of the biggest consumer markets. Many big brands and retailers are from Germany, and also Germany has, within initiatives like the G7 and the G20, quite a good agenda-setting power. I think maybe as a first approach of a solution, we would like to suggest that we consider more multi-stakeholder initiatives. I will say a bit more about this afterwards, but we have made quite good experiences with an initiative that we set up in 2014. It's a Sustainable Textile Partnership. May I just have a quick raise of hands who knows of it? Okay, we have also 2 members or associated members on the panel. And it is an initiative that within only 3 years has gathered basically 50% of the German textile sector. Big brands like Gary Weber, Primark, Kick, Chibo, Aldi, and so on, H&M, C&A are all within this partnership. And I think it is a good start to find solutions.
Okay, great. Laura.
Yeah, hello everyone. I'm Laura from Clean Clothes Campaign as an urgent appeals coordinator here for CCC Germany. I work directly with workers and their trade unions in garment production countries. And whenever there's a violation in a factory, these workers or their trade unions get in contact with us, and then we lobby with the brands here, for me, the brands that are headquartered in Germany, and try to improve conditions at the workplace. How would we change the problem that has been so blatant in all our eyes since the Rana Plaza collapse? I think the CCC is mainly advocating for transparency, mandatory transparency. We need to know where the clothes are made. All fashion brands should disclose their suppliers. And we also advocate for enforceable brand agreements. We think the times of voluntary CSR initiative is over. We have seen at Rana Plaza, we have seen at the Ali Enterprise factory fire that mere civil CSR initiatives don't work, social auditing doesn't work, so we need enforceable brand agreements such as the Bangladesh Accord to really change something in the fast fashion industry.
Okay, cool. I'm Sarah. I head up the policy-related matters for Fashion Revolution, and I would agree with everything that Laura just said. We come from that kind of point of view as well. And we were essentially we're pretty new. We were created as a response to the Rana Plaza disaster, and we've since grown into a huge global fashion activism movement in 100 countries. And as you said, we're focused on, advocating for a cleaner, safer, fairer, and also more transparent fashion industry. But ultimately, where we're coming from around this problem is that we believe that there needs to be radical systemic change in the way that our clothes are produced, sold, consumed, and used. And we're focused on raising awareness and also galvanizing consumers, who we prefer to call citizens, because we're all consumers, but we're more than that. But we believe this big change is everybody's responsibility. So that means that we engage with and put pressure on the industry players, governments, academia, and the media too. And essentially what we're really trying to do is to create a cultural shift, because that's where we feel like not enough attention has been placed. And because we're quite a creative bunch, we feel like Fashion Revolution's well placed to do that. So that's where we're coming from in this conversation.
Hi, I'm Julien. I'm from the company Eden, which is a New York-based fashion company. So I think I'm the only one representing a brand here. So I feel a little bit like the enemy in a way, because 3 years ago when I started the discussion with LVMH about joining Eden, who's stand as an ethical fashion brand, after a very fast study, we always go to the same conclusion that do we really need an extra brand? Do we really need more clothes? There is something very easy to get to this point, but it is an industry that I think can also bring awareness, and just there's opportunity to show another way to develop this industry. And Eden started in 2005, and we're still not perfect, but we're really committed to look at all of our development through an ethical and sustainable lens. And we have now, a strong pillar. We are not just standing for one value. We have social value, we have fair trade value, producing 80% in Africa. And we also have a part which is really showcasing the artisan work, showcasing alternative in terms of new development, working with a region where there is less opportunity. And I think the whole, local demographic question, it's very personal for where you stand, and it's a global industry. And at one point, as far as there is a commitment, I think no one's is capable of even being on the side where there is not a book and boxes to check to be sure that you're 100% sustainable. And even talking to other company sharing the same value as us, I think everyone is applying different recipe, but I think it's about bringing and be comfortable and secure in the decision you're making. And it's going to take time. We've been through already in over 12 years, a lot of, changing and crisis, trying to act the right way. And yeah, we see potential and we see opportunity.
You don't have to push anything.
I don't have, okay. Oh, great. Right. So I'm Doug. Currently, I'm retired. I retired in 2012 from the university, but I've been working as a consultant since. And I always find events like this particular, and this was my experience when I was in the design school at the university, having come from an industrial relations background. For me, there seem to be two worlds. There's this ethical fashion world, or ethical clothing world, I guess that most people here are part of, and that's great. And it's doing good work, and there's a trickle-down effect in terms of the other world, which is the mainstream fashion world out there, that I'm personally much more concerned about. And I think someone said this morning, we should feel good about ourselves, and that's quite right. I think the work that's being done in the whole ethical fashion end is great. Although it's interesting what Angela's saying about maybe the working conditions as far as designers are concerned in that part of the industry leaves quite a bit to be desired. So, and for me, that's a kind of an area of importance. The other main thing I just want to say very briefly, and then I'll get into the detail as we go through the questions, is that I think we're fundamentally dealing with a major contradiction, which is fashion's about individuals. It always has been, always will be. But even the production of fashion is also about an individual approach because it's about competition. Yet the answers to all the problems that the fashion industry throws up are collective. And so the task that we have is about finding collective ways of dealing with some of the problems that we have. And we're running up against problems there because we get hit with EU competition law. In the US, it's antitrust law when brands try and collaborate on key issues. And we'll talk about this, but you mentioned it in the brief. You know, we've seen some really quite interesting initiatives emerge after Rana Plaza, the Accord, which, by the way, is now threatened. But we'll talk about that later. And then we're about to enter into a very, very interesting week with the Action, Collaboration, Transformation Initiative. For those of you who are not aware of ACT, as it's called, the director lives here in Berlin. But we're dealing with largely about 19 brands that have committed to move the industry towards industry-wide collective bargaining as a method of dealing with the living wage problem. Okay? And in fact, a whole host of other problems besides. That task is enormous. And maybe if you want to ask me about that later on, I'll talk about it. But we're in a very critical phase as far as that's concerned. So I'll stop there.
Okay, many thanks. So after these short notes of introduction, you've probably heard that we also, probably like the last panel, position ourselves as the good guys here on the stage. But that doesn't mean we don't disagree or we don't have to discuss some of the different angles and approaches that we have. Now, what we will do is we'll have 3 rounds sort of questions and then open up to the floor. And the first question really is of defining the problem in a way. So what, when, and where is the problem? The dramatic images of the collapsed factory building of Rana Plaza, of course, rouse the temptation to locate the problem in an all too easy way. It's lacking standards in textile-producing countries like Bangladesh, it seems, that are the problem. Consumers, governments, and companies in more affluent consumer countries are called to assume responsibility for the consequences of their activities, that is, to make ethical choices, and to help establish international frameworks. But goods and consumers are increasingly mobile. Sweatshops employing immigrants are increasingly evident in Europe too. Some of the problems of labor in fashion were just also discussed in the previous talk. So after their initial usage, clothes begin their journeys as waste, second-hand goods, or upcycled products, while the ecological impacts of textile production carry far into the future. So times and places are linked across distance, yet kept neatly apart, by sets of business models which maximize circulation in the name of revenue generation. So the question really is, how do we define the scope and how do we identify the problem and the scope for possible policies? I'll start again with Vera, if I may.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, as you just said, with Rana Plaza, many media or everyone was just blaming the lack of standards in the producing factories of the supply chains. But I think this blaming of everyone against everyone else is one of the big problems. And if we want to identify or define the scope of possible solutions or policies, we all have to sit together. Because now that I'm somehow responsible for this sustainable textile partnership and I interact with lots of different actors from businesses and also factories in developing countries, with NGOs, with standards organizations, everyone is blaming everyone. The NGOs say to us as the government, we just need stricter laws. Brands and retailers blame the consumers because apparently their purchasing decisions are not in line with their apparently more sustainable awareness. The consumers blame the brands and retailers because apparently there's not so much of a choice in the shops. The trade unions in developing countries, they blame the factory owners because they apparently violate human rights. On the other hand, the factory owners in Bangladesh blame, for example, German or international brands and retailers because they're not willing to give enough time. So in the end, I think if we want to find policies or solutions, we have no other choice than bring all these actors at the table and nail them down to do the best in their respective frame.
Laura, do you maybe?
Yeah, okay, what, where, and when is the problem? I think the problem is everywhere where garments are produced. Many people ask me, okay, working conditions seem to be really bad in Bangladesh, so should I not buy anything made in Bangladesh? And I said, no, it's not only about Bangladesh. CCC has done research that found out that workers in Eastern European garment production earn almost as less as workers in Asian countries. So it's not about a particular country, it's about the industry, and it's about what fast fashion is based on. It's based on cheap production, and cheap production only works if you exploit labor, and this needs to stop. So we need laws, and we need law enforcement by the governments where garments are produced. But we also need to use our leverage here in the European Union, for example. The European Union gives lots of trade incentives to garment-producing developing countries. So these trade incentives are not just there, they are also linked to complying with international labor standards. And I think the EU should use its leverage more to actually investigate whether these countries are complying with all these standards. So I think it's not only about the governments in garment-producing countries that need to enforce the laws, it's also about leverage that we need to use here in the EU. It's about leverage that global brands need to use, that they have on their suppliers to really comply with laws and also with their codes of conduct.
Sarah, where's the problem for you?
Well, I mean, I prepared an answer too, which is basically kind of saying essentially the same thing, so I'm not going to repeat it too much. But yeah, I mean, I guess the problem is essentially that we've got a hugely globalized, very fragmented value chains where, the blame and burden is constantly passed around. So it's always someone else's fault. When the fact of the matter, it's everybody's, it's, brands and retailers who need to take more responsibility and change their business and purchasing practices. It's governments who should, everywhere, who should better enforce laws and standards and use the tools like Laura was just describing. It's consumers who should stop over-consuming and should be willing to pay higher prices, and that's something that we're particularly focused on kind of stimulating, galvanizing that shift. And it's, the manufacturers and suppliers who should stop being so, in some ways corrupt or greedy or exploitative, which we see sometimes happen. And essentially it's kind of about recalibrating the imbalances of power, which is in the supply chain, which is obviously easier said than done because, power is a big concept. It's a struggle. It's a constant negotiation. And so what we're trying to do in that sense is kind of empower citizens to have agency, because what we've seen through the 4 years of conversations with the public, especially through digital or through social media, is that consumers feel powerless in this conversation to actually make a change. So we're trying to sort of drive that that agency, and so whether that's making small changes in their own shopping habits or whether it's pushing for big changes from their governments that represent them or the big brands and retailers that they shop from. And I just wanted to say one last thing in regards to this thing about fast fashion. It's not just fast fashion that's the problem. It's all of fashion, because the luxury companies are producing in some of the same places where the big fast fashion retailers are producing as well, though commanding a much higher price, and their margins are much, much bigger. So I just want to make sure that this is a broad conversation, not just about fast fashion.
Thanks. Julien, how do you define the problem?
I think what's important is first to divide maybe what is environmentally and ecologically an issue and what is more related to the social. impact. I think very often when you talk about sustainability, and we can put so many things behind it, I think it's important to make this first kind of two distinction. And after, yes, I agree that it's the full industry who has a problem, and everyone needs to be conscious, kind of committed through it, but there is different problematic based on your positioning. There is different problematic if you are Nike, H&M, or luxury group. I think, and Eden doesn't stand for luxury group, so I don't put myself in this environment, but I think when you look at the quantity, when you look at the volume, when you look at the person that are related to this impact, yes, you can blame Gucci or you could blame Stella McCartney that she doesn't do enough, but she reached less than 0.2% of the world population, and the volume that are generated could be bad example or should be used as example. But I think we also need to stand out when we look at this big issue and really be able to identify which family of garment and which price point we are talking to. It's important that maybe the one who has the more visibility in terms of communication and press lead the example, but the urgency, I think, is on the volume. And I think very often, reading all article and all study, it's very difficult to analyze where are this big volume that we're talking to, because they're also just products that are not branded who are part of the problem. A lot of them actually are products that are not branded. So you cannot, just blame and go against this, because we're talking about local, small activity and distribution, local brand that doesn't go out of their own base markets. So these are what represents the volume, the mass of what most of the people of this multi-billion industry is representing. And I think that is what also need to be known and kind of break down, whatever the example that's as part of the industry you need to play.
Doug.
So I think specifically on Rana Plaza, I think we have to answer the question, why was it that the workers were instructed to go back in the day after a crack was discovered, when the bank workers and the shop workers on the bottom floors were allowed to go home? That gets us into the realm of buying practices. And I just want to come back to Felix's slide this morning. He kindly lent me it. Taking a dissociation perspective on value creation seriously means being open about what is made visible or invisible, what's highlighted or ignored, and who's doing it and for what benefit. The thing that's not open really is the whole price structure of a garment. And specifically, the fact that most buyers operate on a target margin. They want a certain percentage margin on that. Let's call it an €100 garment, 60, roughly, okay? Maybe €5 duty and transport cost leaves 35 manufacturing cost. The vast bulk of that manufacturing cost will be fabric, leaving a very small amount for overhead, margin, and labor. Now, think about it. If there's a rise in a minimum wage, which increases the labor cost, and the brand is not prepared to move on margin, you either get a fall in price, and we've been getting serious falls in our import prices, if you like, in garments, and or the margin of the factory will be compromised, unless the factory management decides to do something about that. And you do get kind of negotiations going on where they might say, well, maybe we can compromise on the quality of the fabric or the number of stitches, quality issues. So where else can you make adjustments if you have rising labor costs? You cut social standards, or you're looking at generally your wage bill. And this is the underlying, in my view, the underlying dynamic in the industry which underpins, and there's serious ILO data about this, massive wage non-compliance. Okay, minimum wage, never mind living wage, minimum wages are not being paid in the industry today. Okay, or workers are being put on, day rates or on flexible contracts. So I think we have to unpack this. And I think I'd like to think there's work being done on that at the moment.
Wow, so that's a very large number of problems identified. A lot of them quite structural and larger than just fast fashion. We said including different differentiations within the overall fashion industry, including price structures, volumes, whole range of different problems. So now the question is, how much change is then, if the problem is so big and so prevalent within the overall fashion industry, the question really is, how much change then is possible within the current fashion system, and is revolution or evolution the way to go? Maybe I can start with you, Julien. Is it revolution, evolution? Which one is it for you?
I'm not sure I can point one of the two. I think revolution in the idea of this construction would mean that you could potentially lose the big actors, and the big actors are the one that at the end create most of this job. Evolution is going to take time, so there is an idea of emergency that you want to bring back. So that's why for me it's difficult to choose one or the other. I think there is definitely something about the distribution to be said. I think, going back to the calculation price, it's quite easy to kind of take a product, and when you're part of this industry, you can easily calculate, which part goes into the fabric, which part goes into the making, and in that regard, what the consumer is going to face first is the fabric that it touches. I think at Eden we've been trying to tell a lot about the factory, tell a lot about the made in, the origin, the work that we're conducting through different African countries. It's very difficult for the consumer to resonate with that. And to be very fair, for having visited many factories quite far in China and having visited factory in Eastern Europe or Africa, or even the one that looked great on photo in Los Angeles, at the end of the day, it's not a very sexy story. Even when the conditions are great, offering this transparency, it's not very seductive, because you lose something, and that is part of the desire, and which is why this conversation here, we can make link with the food industry, for instance, but the difference is you need to create this desire for your consumer to be willing to, and hopefully they're going to start reading at the content on the clothes and the mating, like now they do automatically when they shop in the food supermarket. But the purchase, and especially when you reach out a certain price, and your advantage is not just the cheap tag, is the desire that the brand is structuring around that. And creating this desire, this excitement around your product, at the same time as showcasing, a simple factory is kind of challenging. So we, for instance, take the road of promoting fabric made in Africa. So we do handloom, we do batik in Ivory Coast, we do all of this is embellishment work, which is something that resonates more with the customer, so they understand the pay that they are the pay and the work behind it. But for the customer to understand the work of a sewers on a machine, it's kind of complicated to be connected with this idea of seduction and value that we were talking before.
So transparency, that's very much your issue, Sarah, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely.
Maybe you want to react.
Yeah, where to start? No, I mean, just directly to respond to that, I mean, I think there are a lot of businesses who do that well in terms of telling the stories about the actors and their supply chains, and even if it's the simple factory, one example is Reformation, who makes these, they're an LA-based brand. I don't think they sell here in Germany, but they do a really great job through their social media and through their website of telling the stories of people who are machinists, pattern cutters, people who literally package up things into boxes and ship them off. They do that in a really compelling way, and you can tell that it resonates because they've got thousands and thousands of comments and likes. So I do think there is ways to do it. We just have to experiment and find ways that work with resonating with consumers, whatever type of consumer they are. For us, we believe that it's both revolution and evolution that's needed. As I said, we really, as our name suggests, believe that a radical change is like a systemic change is needed, but that evolution is an important tool to get there, and that there's smaller, although still probably quite large and ambitious and impactful changes we can make now within the existing system we have to improve working conditions and minimize environmental degradation, such as some of the work that Clean Clothes Campaign does, on the ground with factories, such as the ACT initiative, which is, potentially going to change things hugely over the next few years, working within the existing kind of model that we have now, but just giving a lot more power and agency and voice to workers. But yeah, this is exactly why we're focused on transparency, because oftentimes when we present the fashion industry as mysterious and seductive, that's also kind of hides some of the complexities and hides some of the issues that are really a huge part of the problem. And so if we have more transparency and we're able to talk about this more in a mainstream public conversation, I think more and more people will begin to understand the complexities, and will be in a better place to make some of these bigger, more radical changes. And so that's really where we're coming from.
Okay, maybe you want to react.
Yeah, I would also disagree with it. I think it's a disconnect if you don't want to show where or how your clothes are made. And I think a lot of, in the fashion industry, maybe a lot of people or a lot of businesses also benefit from this disconnect, right? That people don't know that it's just unsustainable to make a t-shirt for 3 or 2 euro. So I think transparency is absolutely needed. It might not per se translate into better working conditions right away, but at least we don't need to dig through the rubble to search for labels to prove that brands have produced somewhere. So for me, transparency is really like a minimum standards that brands should commit to. And I think how much change is possible within the existence system, I think there is a lot of change that is possible, and we need to start at different levels. So on the production level, where we work with workers in the factories. So what I see is that I think a lot of the problems could actually be tackled if workers had a representative, a trade union in their factory, which could bargain for better wages, which could bargain for at least the payment of the minimum wage, which is true, which is often not even paid, and also bargain for safer working conditions, for better conditions, higher pay, and so that's on a production level. But then also at the brands level, they need to really not only commit, but they need to show and act on their commitment, on their promises. And I think they can only do that by entering agreements that are really enforceable and that are legally binding. And as a government, you need to set a framework that brands need to operate in. So you need to make human rights due diligence mandatory by passing laws or by making transparency mandatory, human rights reporting mandatory for brands.
Doug, is it evolution or revolution for you?
I think there's probably an evolving revolution, but it's not the one we want. And that is digitization, because we're not far off robotized clothing factories, folks. They're making footwear now with robots, and they stiffen fabric so that they can make T-shirts as though they were working with sheet metal. And that's going to have an enormous impact on the 40, 50, 60 million, whatever the figure is, of workers out there in the supply chains. In the meantime, I said answers would need to be collective. So let's just quickly look at the three collective initiatives so far. The first one being actually the Freedom of Association Protocol in Indonesia, which actually was born out of collaboration between Clean Clothes, Oxfam and the trade unions at a meeting in Hong Kong following the Beijing Olympics, where the sportswear brands committed in Indonesia to providing access and facilities for trade unionists and trade union officers to go about their business in their sportswear supplier factories. That's kind of really important point, because basically we're dealing with an anti-trade union industry. Now that might not resonate with many people here, but you mentioned before, labour is a commodity. It's not, right? Or it certainly should not be. Now, how do you make it not a commodity? As designers, you have to organise yourselves, right? You need organisation, and you need to be determining a rate for your time. And that has to be presented to the industry. And that's exactly what a collective effort is. And that's exactly what the ACT initiative is trying to achieve, through unions in the production countries that meet with manufacturers' associations and determine the rate for the job, which then brands have to pay, okay? Because that's then, you can extend it. I think they call it in German the Allgemeine Verbindlichkeitserklärung. So you extend it to the industry, and then that becomes law. The third initiative, which is the Accord, and is now slightly being threatened because the Bangladesh Garment Manufacturers Association are kind of well in with the government. In fact, half the government's factory owners. And they've been twitching for a long time about the Accord. They don't like the intrusion in the factories. So they want the Accord shut down. But it's not as simple as that. The government, we were led to believe the government had served notice that would be gone in 6 months, but there has been a revision of that, which is that in 6 months it will be reviewed, and then it'll be ongoing until 2021. And why is that important? Because it, first of all, has provided a great deal of transparency, a great deal of collaboration between brands, because you can collaborate much more on health and safety. It's not it is a cost factor, but it's not a cost factor in terms of price. And that's where it gets a bit sensitive when we're looking at collaboration around wages, and that often the competition lawyers can wade in and try and frustrate any collective efforts on the part of brands to discuss that. So it's slow, right? But again, it has to be, it's about a collective approach.
Okay, Vera, what do you think?
I think there's a lot of truth in what my previous speaker said. With this question, revolution or evolution, I thought it's very helpful to imagine the textile industry as a human organism. I see my husband there in the back. He just showed up. He's not from this university, but nice that you're here. We were training yesterday with the questions. Yeah, so I think it's really helpful if we want to define what solutions are best if we imagine the textile sector as a human organism. Basically, we have different organs, like the actors, NGOs, governments, businesses, and so on and so on. And these organs, they have to be healthy by themselves, but they also have to interact healthily with each other. So if we speak of revolution or evolution, revolution would mean just cutting out, killing organs, cutting them out and throwing them out. This is not possible. But I think in some ways, for example, if we have let's say, damaging bacteria, we could compare them to toxic chemicals. Here, revolution is possible if, for example, a technical invention brings about a substitute for a toxic chemical. So from one day to the other, it might be that huge trading retailers or brands can replace these toxic chemicals in their whole global value chains. But the actors themselves, which are always constituted of humans like you and me, I think there is no such thing like revolution, because always also the mindsets and the value systems within the people have to change to make a revolution. So to be very precise maybe, if, coming back from the philosophical deliberations, let's say, for example, the CEO of a big retailer or brand says, okay, from tomorrow on, I want to become sustainable. How should this be possible? If you think of the end of the value chain and you imagine, for example, a cotton farmer, this cotton farmer in many cases maybe cannot even read or write. He has to learn how to read and write to understand maybe also his citizens' rights, human rights, his laborer rights. He has to be paid a fair wage. He has to be taught how to implement, for example, sustainable agricultural technologies. This just needs time. And if you ask me as a government official what revolution might think, I think my previous speakers, the lady from Future Fashion Forward, Fashion Revolution, and from the Clean Clothes campaign, you often ask the governments to make laws. But making laws is not really the solution. If I consider Albania, for example, Albania has one of the world's most wonderful legislations. Even homosexual marriages are allowed now in a country that some years ago was still communist. So the legislation is perfect, but on the ground nothing is functioning. Why? Because the whole macroeconomic and political structure of the country is still not as developed. So we have corruption, we have maybe some farmers who work far away in mountainous areas. How do you want to control this? You can make a lot of laws, but if you don't have the structure to control them, they don't make sense. And that's why we in Germany, we said that we better invest our energies on this multi-stakeholder initiative, the textile partnership, where we can see really what each actor can do.
When we're talking about values, I think it's an interesting point, because no one makes choices against their own financial interest in our current system, whether you're a state or a company or consumer. And that's kind of exactly the problem. You know, in our current economic paradigm, our interests are measured solely by money, by profits and growth. And personally, I don't know if I can imagine a prevailing system where financial interest isn't part of the equation, but we need a new system that places greater, if not equal, value on non-financial interests too, including, you know, human environmental well-being. And, you know, because without these things, essentially, we're not going to survive in the future. Now, I don't think there's an easy answer to get to that point, but ultimately it's up to the state and legal institutions to either write new rules and actually ensure that they're enforced. It requires a cultural shift too, which can happen. The system we live in at the moment isn't inevitable. It hasn't always been this way. It's not our natural way of existing. We can shift that too, and it's up to citizens and companies to enact some of that cultural shift. So again, it's everybody's role and responsibility to define new standards and new values.
Thank you. Julien?
Yeah, I think value-wise, I think it's definitely both ecological and social, but I think the main issue is really the education around that. And that's where the question of regulation and law is complex, because depending on where you work and what you do, you know, I don't think there is one rule, one way to go. Eden, for instance, made the mistake a few years ago to produce organic cotton in certain regions of Africa, which we still stopped doing, and now we work with Better Cotton Initiative, BCI, to produce our cotton. And I was not part of the company at that time, but I can understand what was the motivation. It seems we want a whole green world. We want to only work with organic cotton. We produce locally in Africa. Let's just combine everything and work out of organization of local farmers. What we didn't realize with her Western thought was we were, taking water from the local population to build this organic cotton, and when you explain that, and then now all of our African cotton are no longer organic, outside sourcing are organic. When you explain that to a consumer who's not educated, he's gonna have the stand of, oh, your cotton is not organic. How could you stand for a sustainable company? I think that's just an example of how the education is complex when you're touching this question. We use recycled polyester as the same kind of question. Do you just not use polyester at all? Recycle, go back to the system. That's the decision we stand for. But is it better to just avoid entirely polyester and variants of it? All of that is education within each company, but also to the customer. It's interesting how the customer can, when you have this stamp of ethical, sustainable company, how the customer came with different level of question. They're going to ask you how much, what are the salary of the people working for you, but they're not going to put this in the context of the country where you produce. So, a sowers working in Kenya, for instance, where we produce, we respect the country regulation, and we travel and visit them 4 times a year, but they're not paid the salary of an American sowers, right? And the customer can face that, put this in consideration, but do you take back opportunity? I think all of that is related to education and question. It's difficult to have a system of regulation that can work for every business. I think the full industry is way too diverse. I don't think you can apply the same regulation to a small designer designing and sewing clothes from his room on Brick Lane to a master, mega company. I think there is looking at the big picture, but after, I think it's really about bringing this question into people's mind during the full process. And unfortunately, maybe the consumer have to be educated in a separate way, because he's not going to lead the first step of the change.
So I'm only going to refer to social standards rather than environmental. It's just too complex a field. But what I would say about social standards, probably with the exception of recent trafficking laws, is that they already exist. And they have done in the form of ILO conventions, which find their way into the codes of conduct of all the brands that function in the industry. So what's the issue? The issue is that they're not being enacted by the countries that are supposed to ratify those conventions in their national law. I think there are commercial reasons, which I've tried to explain, which account for that. So how do you kind of monitor that? And one of the problems with a neoliberal kind of economy that we have, and the rollback of the public sector, is that factory inspectors are being reduced, right? The numbers of factory inspectors are being reduced. And then if you're in an anti-trade union industry, you don't have collective vigilance by the workers over some of the non-compliances that are going on, and you have to rely on external auditors, commercial auditors, okay, who may or may not be experienced in the day-to-day kind of running of a factory and the various ways in which things can be hidden. And often, it's very wasteful, that, because sometimes there's always a supplier that's generally pulled out and said, I had 52 audits last year, 1 a week, which is crazy. But you do get cases like that. So there have been efforts, and MSIs are often one way of trying to kind of rationalize that approach by having a joint way of doing it. But I think it's about trying to move away from that system and having a much more, in place, in country, and well-trained trade union and labour administration kind of form of monitoring of standards.
Okay. Vera.
Sorry, one more thing, because it's starting to get us into, I think a discussion about labelling. And like Vera, you started by saying, correct me if I'm wrong, that it took 30 years to have a food label.
The food label was faster, about 8 years or so.
Okay, but it took a while to get there, and you were suggesting it may take a while before we get to, and then you didn't say what, but I'm assuming you mean some kind of label that you would put on garments, and then that begs the question, what kind of label when you look at all the different environmental and social standards out there, whilst I think, picking your point up, that there quite clearly is and some people have called this conscientious consumers who know their stuff, right, and know what they're looking for, and they buy, say, from Edun and want to know more. But, what are most people out there in the streets when they go shopping for clothes, and I include myself, say, well, does it look good on me? What's the price? And the last thing that I'm probably going to think about is, and I won't know anyway, right? I might know if this is a toxic garment, hopefully. No, I'm going to take up too much time for this thing.
No,
but well, all right. I'll tell you a little story. And this is when I became chair of ethical fashion, which was a problem in itself because in the UK, ethical, by and large, means social compliance, but in other circles, it means sustainability as well. So I was feeling very nervous that I couldn't profess anything about sustainability. It wasn't my area. And I used to come to events and I was having cold sweats that I was going to get posed the question, well, where do you buy your clothes? Right? And it happened. It happened, but it was a Fair Wear Foundation meeting. And I was the first to answer because I suddenly realized, and I can do the same today, I'm almost exclusively Marks and Spencer, right? Now, Marks and Spencer, accidentally, if you like, has what's called Plan A. And the reason they call it Plan A is because they have no Plan B. And it's a business model that's supposed to be based on sustainability. The fact that they're a fairly anti-union company is by the by. So then I asked myself, well, do I consciously go and buy stuff from M&S? And then I realized why I'm almost exclusively M&S. Because cleverly, M&S funded the construction of a bus station at the other end of their store, and I walk through the store, the bus station, every night. And I'm a busy guy. And the only reason that I would buy stuff off the shelf wasn't because I was particularly ethically conscious. It was just, well, that looks all right, I'll have that. Now, the lesson in there, I mean, okay, we can argue about how right on M&S is, but at least if that, agony's taken away of having to kind of look through labels to, in other words, the company has done its due diligence across all the social and environmental standards. We know how big a task that is. But then you take, happen to be a believer in, I don't have that much faith in individuals as far as fashion's concerned in there being this big groundswell movement where it's all going to change by some kind of boycott and everybody then swings to whoever the ethical ones are. I just don't see that happening. So where's the onus? The onus is with government and the onus is with the industry and everybody in it. That's kind of my take on it.
Okay,
Sorry, that was a bit long.
I love the stories, but I would love to also give Vera the opportunity to react, because this was directly also on the multi-stakeholder initiative and labeling. So,
yeah. I think the biggest problem, if it comes to labeling, is that in Germany alone, we have about 500 different textile labels, and in the world, I don't know, many more. But there's also some good news. I was 4 weeks ago in Geneva at a conference of the ITC, which is the International Trade Conference from the United Nations and supported by the World Bank. And they presented a tool, or basically a database, which gives an assessment of basically all the existing labels. And they judge them according to their social ambitiousness, to their ecological ambitiousness, and also their credibility. So, for example, if a company judges itself, like, I don't know, H&M conscious, this would not get the credibility plus, for example. And this database has become the basis of a program that the German government started to help the German consumers to immediately identify in the shop if a textile is sustainable or not. We're still at the beginning, but there is a web tool and a website that is called Siegelklarheit, something like standards clarity or something. And if you download this on your smartphone and you see in a shop any kind of label, you can just scan it, and with one click you get either a dark green smiley or a light green smiley who's not so much smiling, or a bit grumpy orange smiley. So basically what we do is we translate all this variety of different labels into very simple smileys. It's just a start. It doesn't reflect the complexity or the deepness of standards, but at least it gives the first indication. I think the state has definitely lots of responsibilities, not only making laws. For example, one of the responsibilities of the governments is to ensure credibility. So if there are labels out on the market, I think it's the responsibility of the governments to make sure that the consumer understands which labels are greenwashing and which ones are credible. So that's the reason why we set up the Siegelklarheit tool. Another responsibility that the government should take over is to initiate multi-stakeholder initiative. I know that others, similar to the German textile partnership, exist in Denmark, for example. France has just has done this law on due diligence. In the UK, we have the Modern Slavery Act. So we have different initiatives in different countries. And I think, yes, sure, the state has to somehow define some minimum standards, but laws are not the perfect means for everything. And then we should also consider that it's not only the governments alone that can take care of proper standardization or harmonization of standards, but it's actually much more the international organizations. Because in the end, if it comes to the practice, the customs, just the normal custom officers, they have to understand if they check the things that goes through the customs, they have to, there's a very simple system needed so that they can recognize which clothes are sustainable or not. And only if this functions, we can think about, for example, tax reduces for sustainable brands, but this is a step that comes a little bit more far ahead. Shall I speak also about the responsibility of the other actors or just about the government?
I don't know. Depends if you want to have some more,
I think
more time for questions.
Maybe just, I keep it short because one point is really important. We always, or we often blame, for example, especially after Rana Plaza, we blame the factory owners in developing countries. And when I was in India and I lived for 3 days with a very simple textile worker to gain the experience, I also got to know her middleman, which was not a very friendly person. He was abusing of her like, I don't know what. But we cannot just blame these people because these middlemen and the factories in the supply chain, basically they get the orders from the brands and retailers. So I think what is really important is that more brands are committing to voluntary sustainability standards also. I leave it at that.
Okay, great. Then Laura.
Yeah, I disagree because I think we want to blame someone, and in that case we need to blame the brands because the brands put these conditions on their suppliers, and suppliers have to squeeze the wages of their workers to meet these conditions. But then I don't think it is a solution to ask these brands to voluntarily improve things. This will not happen. We have seen it. We have, the same is true for all this labeling. I mean, the Ali Enterprise factory had an SA 8000 certificate. It had obviously just been inspected days before the fire broke out. It does not work. We need mandatory and binding regulation for brands. I don't think that brands will just voluntarily come together and improve conditions to the extent that is needed. And I think that this is the responsibility of the governments, both here and in the production countries. But of course, power also lies with the consumers. And of course, brands will only produce as long as these cheap clothes are bought. And just to come back to Duff's story, why are you buying from M&S? a lot of the brands are also trying to give themselves a very sustainable image because they have realized that sustainability sells. Yeah, and you have a conscious cotton collection at H&M, and at the same point in time, we just read in the media days ago, they're burning tons and tons of still usable clothes. Where is this sustainable? This is the most unsustainable practice there is.
May I
You want to
react?
react? Yeah.
Exactly, because I think we're not so far away from each other. May I just ask a very short question back? For example, you find it good if brands and retailers commit, for example, to the GOTS or the Fair Wear Foundation standards or fair trade standards? But this is something you would still somehow acknowledge, even though it's voluntary.
Yes, of course, I do acknowledge voluntary commitments, but I think they really, what we want to see is we want to see some effect. And I have dealt with brands who are members of the Fair Wear Foundation and who have still very, very serious labor rights violations in their supplier factories.
In other, because I know that there's different standards, for example, GOTS or Fair Wear Foundation, they usually don't cover the full supply chain, basically from the raw material production to the shops. So if they just pick out one of the activities of the supply chain, for sure it is possible that in other areas there are some violations.
But we have come across violations in the manufacturing of garments, and that is covered by these labels or by these initiatives.
So basically you speak about scandals or cases where the standard controls have not functioned, right?
Yes.
Okay, I think this happens here and there, and we are all unhappy about it, but what I also think is really important, and this is also maybe something I would like to tell to the journalists here, if we have a standard that is 95% functioning, good, transparent, the controlling persons do good work, like I would say, for example, the fair trade standard, then I think we should be really careful if there's here or there a scandal, and by writing too much lopsidedly about the scandal without putting it into a proper context, I think we take the credibility that the consumer has into these labels, and we will lose even more of the support for sustainability labels.
Okay, you started addressing the journalists, and I would say let's open up the floor to each and every one. Of course, making some linkages maybe to the first panel, but also to the floor more broadly. I already see a number of hands going up. If you can distribute the microphone.
If I may, yeah? Can I start?
Yes. I'm thinking that maybe we can collect a couple of questions together and then answer them. So please go ahead.
That's fine for me.
Question.
I would like to address...
one question. If I could ask you to briefly introduce yourself, that would be awesome.
I'm Professor Caroline Lurch. I'm teaching fashion at the UVK.
Great.
I would like to... I'm interested in the matter of the optimization that Mr. Miller was briefly addressing. I think this is really a missed subject here in this conversation, because this is something so happening now. I just traveled from Vienna, where I didn't even speak to a person when I was checking in my bag. So this is coming up, this is happening now, and I think there's no way we can prevent this. So also the Nike shoe you were mentioning, I think this is in the textile industry actually a very limited phenomenon. We are in textile industries, we are dealing with a technology that is more than hundreds of years old. I mean, the knitting practice is one of the more advanced technologies that allows that a garment is fully automated. So actually what I'm wondering is this not maybe also a chance to get our €5 t-shirt that is actually fully made automatically, if we find a way to spread the wealth that is created by this? Isn't that more of a more progressive way to deal with this matter? I'm not a professional in economics, so I don't really know the consequences, but I'm just interested in what you would think about such an approach.
Okay, great. Let's have a second and third question. You have the microphone.
Hi, I'm Louise Crew, a geography professor from the University of Nottingham in the UK. I think this was a fascinating session because to me it reveals very, very clearly how we can only really understand the geographies and the spaces of fashion through thinking about scale. And we need to understand that scale is always relational. It's in capital's interest to make sure we don't know about the kind of relationality between scales, and so we kind of fall back on these constructs of, oh, it's over there somewhere so we can't do anything about it, or oh, it's over here and that's fine, or fast or slow or luxury. You know, all of these kind of representations just don't stack up. So I think we really, really have to take a kind of a really textured, geographical, relational approach to scale, and I think we'll find ourselves in some interesting territory. Thank you.
Yes. Angela McRobbie from Goldsmiths. I'd just like to follow up one point from Doug, which I think also extends right across our discussions, which is the need for a kind of reinvention of trade unionism. That really seems to me at the heart of the debate, and also is implicitly less hierarchical a process than some of the other accords and agreements that if one can have a kind of idea of both universal but also national and transnational trade union. And the reason I make this point is because, of course, in the UK, it's trade unionism that has been decimated through 20, 30 years of neoliberalism. For example, in retail, there used to be a high level of trade union membership in maybe Marks and Spencer's, I don't know. The union was Usdaw, and at a certain point in time, 60% of people working behind the shop counter were trade unionised, and now it's 10%. Indeed, I read a recent report that said that in fashion retail in Scotland, 60% of people working behind the counter in Benetton, in M&S, in Jigsaw, in Whistles, were graduates working on temporary contracts. And indeed, if you walk along Oxford Street into all the main stores, the conditions of labour are those of graduates in our university working maybe 10 hours a week, 15 hours a week, 16 hours a week. No question of trade unionism. So I think actually reimagining a trade union so that it's not just a place of the white men of a certain type would be, and is a genuinely multicultural and gendered organisation would be important.
Okay, maybe let's, one was a comment, I would think, from Louise more about scale. Maybe we can take the other two questions together, because I guess they do relate in the sense of what happens through automation and what is the role of trade unions. Who wants to start? You want to start?
Cool. To the first point, I think it's really interesting and kind of a slightly new topic. This, everyone's sort of kind of like fearful and doesn't know what to do about this looming like automation. But I think it doesn't have to it doesn't inevitably have to mean something negative. It's how it manifests. And I would encourage you to check out some of the thinking done by Becky Early around kind of like some of the aspects of fashion that needs to change around the model, the mindset, and looking at approaches that are both fast and slow in terms of, and what that might look like for how we experience clothing, how clothing is made, how it's disposed of. Because I think it can kind of speak to some of those questions around what a more automated technological industry is going to look like in the future that's also more egalitarian and potentially more sustainable socially and ecologically. And for me too, this is why if we are going to move towards a more automated future, why trade, the point about trade unionism and how that needs to be reinvented is so important. It's something that Fashion Revolution is really thinking about. For example, we just did a year-long project called the Garment Worker Diaries, where we met with garment workers in Cambodia, India, and Bangladesh every single week for a year to understand their financials, income and expenditure, and also their living and working conditions in quite a holistic sort of sense of what their lives look like for a prolonged period. And what really came out of that is just this need for a voice. It's not a novel thing. Lots of other research
studies have come to the same thing. But it really pushed us to want to look more at that side of things. So one thing that now we're really striving to do is to kind of modernize the conversation for millennials and Gen Z about the importance of labor movements, trade unionism, collective bargaining for workers on that side of thing, but for young people and just for the wider fashion industry. So that's certainly something we're going to be talking about a lot more in the future.
Well, I think it's called Industry 4.0, and I think it will take a while to roll out in some countries where the price of labour is so low that it's worth continuing with that. What's interesting, I mean, if you look at this country and even the UK, where there was serious migration of labour, because what we're talking about is structural change. And it's worrying because if we do get in some countries massive investment in new technology, you know, some of these countries are seriously dependent on garment manufacture for their export earnings. And if that goes, then you've got a major structural issue in the industry and you need some time to kind of adjust to that. So think now to say Germany and what happened when there was a migration of manufacturing out of this country, and there has been because there's not much of a textile industry left. But then you look at Adidas and what they are doing, because they've got a big R&D centre probably in Herzogenaurach or wherever it is, and they're massively kind of investing in high-speed, customer-oriented footwear manufacture. In other words, they've kind of brought it back here, right? But then you've got to think about, right, but Industry 4.0 is going to be affecting all facets of the economy. And are we going to have an economic system that will provide all these unemployed workers, all these workers made redundant by new technology with the income to buy these shoes that Adidas are making for obviously much lower price than you hope than they are at the moment? And that gets you into all this guaranteed basic income debate, I would say. Whether there's anything like that goes on in say, some of the supply countries, I have no idea. Okay? So it's something that we've got to think about. It's going to be happening, as you say, in some areas it's already happening very quickly. But I think we've got a few years to go before we start seeing it really impact.
Okay, let's take a second round of questions, a final round of questions. 1, 2. You have a microphone already, so maybe you can go ahead.
Hi,
and please
I'm
introduce
yourself. I'm Professor of Fashion Design in Weißensee. My impression on this discussion so far, well, I'm a bit angry about what I heard so far because there's 2 points I want to make. First is, I don't know if you've heard about global warming. For me, not a day goes by without a headline in one of the newspapers about, I don't know, a new ecological catastrophe, an iceberg melting, some species dying, while you're sitting there discussing on which corner of the world you want to start thinking about what to change. And I think the urgency that we already feel hasn't reached you somehow, or I don't know, but it doesn't sound like it. I think the fashion industry has to act a bit quicker than it has in the last couple of years, and it doesn't seem to happen yet. And the other thing I was a bit shocked about was that the ministry representative tells me here that laws don't work. This really shocked me because, I mean, just to make a simple example again, like you did, well, there's a law in Germany that doesn't allow me to buy guns, and I don't know anybody who possesses a gun. And I think in the US, the situation is different. And this is, to my knowledge, regulated by a law. So to my knowledge, laws do work. And this is just a simple example. And I think it's absolutely immoral to blame the end of the chain, the consumer, to these problems, because I'm definitely not going to change the world by choosing an organic muesli in the morning to a conventionally produced muesli. And in my mind, it's the big companies that are only the ones who can make a change, and they will only change when they're forced to do it. And they're definitely not forced by one little consumer choice, and definitely not by thousands. And the proof for that is all the scandals we had in the last couple of years concerning cars in Germany, the diesel scandals, and I'm sure you find more proofs for that. But companies are not going to change unless there's a law that makes them change.
Okay, I'm sure people want to react to that. We have a few more questions first. One in the back, and then...
Yes. Hi, my name is Tatjana. I'm from University of Cologne, and I research on transnational organization of workers along the garment value chain. And yes, since I'm coming from a union perspective here, I wanted to bring that back into the discussion, and also draw a bit on what there was another comment by Professor Lurch on unions, and I would agree to a certain extent the unions also need to react to these new challenges, but on the other hand, in my research and in working with the unions, I've seen that there's a tremendous challenge for organizing, which is due to the economic pressure that is exercised through the capitalist system in general, but also through the brands specifically. And this does not only account for countries like Bangladesh and India, but for Germany as well. Unions, works councils at big brands, we don't have to name them, I guess, are experiencing harassment and are being hindered in their work, even here in Germany, even though we have those strong laws. But at the same time, in Germany, we also have seen a drawing back of the state from regulating the labor sector. And thus, I think ensuring freedom of association is a key part if we want to really improve sustainably working conditions. And then the question is really, we have seen that standards do not work so well. There are so many studies in academia that standards can ensure outcome standards, like something that you can prove with a photo, maybe health, or maybe like safety, like, okay, the workers don't have gloves, the workers don't have masks, there's no drinking water facilities that you can prove. Okay, you can remediate, but freedom of association is more complex, because how can you prove an ongoing harassment, like verbal harassment, intimidations of workers in the factory for not joining the union? So I just wanted to ask maybe all the participants what they are doing, what they could imagine that we could do to ensure freedom of association along the value chain.
There was one more question.
Working? Can I switch? Hello? I'm Aisha, a student from UDK, and I want to build on the previous comments. So if policies and regulations and labels don't work, what do you think about proposing more financial incentives, such as Common Objective, the new platform of Ethical Fashion Forum, which will launch later this year, I think, and which proposes a model to put forward brands and other people along the supply chain that enforce these ethical practices and reward them with financial advantages.
Okay, we have one final question, and then I give the floor to the panelists to respond.
It was also building on the comment before. I'm a journalist, Yeah, that was the introduction. I just wanted to say that I also agree on the law aspect of this, because I go every year to the Copenhagen Sustainability Conference, and every year a lot of great ideas come through. And every year I leave thinking we've finally saved the world, and every year I go back and nothing has changed. And so one of the this aspect of the conference, this feeling of uselessness, was addressed last time, and it was agreed that it's impossible to rely uniquely on the goodwill of the consumers who are becoming more conscious, or the brands that are also becoming more sustainable, because there will be 10 billion people needing clothes in a few years. We are reaching an incredible amount of world population. So even if we consume, each of us less, consumption is going to increase either way, and this is bad. So I think it is clear that a revolution is necessary here. We cannot do step-by-step small increments of... So some of the options that were discussed, for example, in terms of labeling and laws, someone suggested that maybe the carbon footprint of each garment should be printed on the label. As we have, washing machine instructions, we could have specified how bad this garment is for the environment. And also taxes, for instance, water taxes. As we already pay a carbon tax, companies pay a carbon tax, why not a water tax with how much water? Because water is going to become a luxury in the future for the world. So obviously companies are driven by financial interest, but sustainability can become a financial interest for these brands if they are forced to pay when they are not sustainable. Okay. Who wants to go? You want to go?
Shall I start? Because the lady was addressing me so charmingly. Okay, on the one hand, I'm really happy to get such an engaged comment, but I can really assure you that the German government, and especially my ministry, is thinking day and night about the climate change. We have a huge department, and I think there are really very few countries who invest so much per capita to somehow do something against the climate change. So I really don't think that this is something we are forgetting here in this debate. And the next thing is, climate change, for example, is one area which is addressed with many indicators that we have in the roadmap that every single member of the textile partnership has to fill out. So basically, it's not that we're forgetting it, it's inside the structure. Every single member, from Primark to Kik, from Gary Weber to C&A and H&M, every single year they have to fill out a plan of indicators with certain measurements, and they have to set goals for the next year. They are evaluated by an independent third party, and at the end of the year they have to present the results. So I think this is really something very specific, and it goes far beyond the voluntary agreements. That you are right, only voluntary agreements will probably not bring us very far. But the approach of the German Textile Partnership, where the government, by the way, is putting a lot of resources in, personal and financial, this approach is, okay, getting into the partnership is voluntary. Every single company in Germany or outside can decide if they want to join or not. But once you are a member, and 50% of the textile revenue is generated by members, once you are inside this partnership, you are part of a binding process, and you don't get out of this. So you have to prove what your progress is. Thank you very much. And then also when the second point, I think probably there was a misunderstanding. I did not say that laws in general don't work. For sure laws work, for sure they do. I was giving the example of Albania. Laws can be very easily written down within a few weeks, but then what do you do if you don't have the structures to enforce them? I think we're forgetting that the global value chains reach back to countries like Bangladesh, India, Pakistan, Ethiopia. I don't know, maybe you have been to one of such developing countries. You can make lots of laws. How do you enforce them? If we in Germany, for example, say, the government writes a law, from tomorrow on, only sustainable clothes are allowed to pass our borders. First, we are the European Union, so first we have to convince the other EU members. Next thing is, What if 2 white shirts pop up at the outer EU borders? You have 2 white shirts. One maybe is sustainably produced, the other one is not. How do you want to control this? But I don't know, I'm very open and I'm very happy if here among the public there are people who can give advice on where maybe there is still an opportunity for legislation that serves sustainability.
Okay, let's give the other participants also a quick moment, an opportunity to respond. I know we're going into the coffee break, so just let's keep it a bit short and try to answer some of the questions.
No, I think it's good that people react this way, and they should, I think. But the question is not that easy, and I think, honestly, if you really want to be radical about it, as soon as you shop a clothing piece that is below $100, you have almost no chance that it's fully sustainable in the way that maybe with your radical mind you would like it. So if you're lucky enough to be able to afford this over $100 piece, yes, you can dress up 100% vegan, 100% sustainable. But one more time, we're talking about less than 1% or than 0.2% of the world population. So that's the first point. I think, as we say, a $3 t-shirt is never going to be sustainable. Maybe, as someone say, if it's 100% made by a machine in Germany, it could potentially be. And maybe this is where we're going, but hopefully the industry would have reinvented itself in a different way to not lose all of this job. So I think, there is more than 5 examples of brands that I can name that were standing for 100% sustainable products. Last year, just in the US, 2 of them closed down and went bankrupt because they cannot sustain. Eden has the chance to be funded by and supported by an important group. Otherwise, today we would not be there and I would not be speaking with you because we haven't even found a way to make the whole picture working. But I think it's a way to go, it's a commitment, and it's about having this conversation to find new alternative. But it's good to have this radical thought and ambition, but it's going to take time. Like the way to get there is going to get time. And the problem, I think, is that this word is just too big. Sustainable is just too big. Being able to have label on clothes, that's great, but for which company can afford that, and it's only the big brand that are going to have the lobbying who are going to be able to have this. All of the rest of the distribution is not going to be able to follow that. Young designer, young brand, not going to be able to have that. Local market, local distribution won't have this. So I feel we're going to, in another way that's, I don't think, like a solution for everyone. We, Eden, cannot even afford the labeling to put on the garment for what even when we do organic, even when we do natural dye, which we do, by the way, we cannot afford to have the label because that costs $20,000 a year just to be able to use the label. So we cannot do this. So I think, the question is way more complex. And the problem, as I said, the word sustainable and ethical is just too vague and too big. I think we need to divide the problematic into under layers of problem to be able to address them one by one. In the US, currently in New York, you have big poster of a denim brand that I won't name that says sustainable, my best sustainable denim pants for $68. And they're actually really successful, and everyone, great journalists are talking about them as the best sustainable company. As a professional, I want to understand how you do a denim for $68, 100% sustainable. Yes, they put the photo of their factory on their website. I check it myself. But after that, what is the information? No more. So I think it's going to be a long way, and I think it's important to kind of identify the positive action. But that's why I think this panel and this conversation could be so active, is that unfortunately, it's an evolution through an answer. And even when you're committed to it, the solutions are not there, and there is no one example, I would say, of a brand that is 100% perfect at the moment.
So on freedom of association, what we found in the International Textile Garment and Leather Workers Federation was that the reason why workers didn't join unions was because they were terrified they'd be sacked. And I think Laura would probably tell you that the urgent appeals that she deals with, probably the majority, are to do with workers who who've been sacked and want their jobs back. So what do we do about that? We came up with this idea, which has yet to be adopted, which would be very simple. A bit of paper which said, and was each worker received it, had to be provided by the factory owner, which said the following: in line with the code of conduct or the codes of conduct of all the buyers in this who source from this factory, I hereby undertake not to victimize you should you wish to exercise your right to join a trade union under the freedom of association provision of those codes of conduct. And it's I got this actually from a guy in Thailand. He said, I want to be able to, like in a football match, you hold up a yellow card or something to if management tries to sack you for joining a union. The interesting thing about it is it's not an organized, you don't need to use the organizer. It's a non-victimization guarantee. And that would be auditable, because at the minute you can't audit freedom of association. Nobody's going to tell you, as an auditor, right? Nobody in the workforce is going to say, oh, terrible, terrible here, their attitude to trade unions, well, I tried to join and I was, because basically that will get back to management and you won't be in a job for very long. Okay, so it's worth rolling out.
Laura.
Yeah, that's a really good idea. I think just a problem would be that many factory managements don't sack worker on the pretext of that they are members of a union, but then for XYZ other reasons. But I think mostly it is for that reason, of course, and we have to find a way to deal with that. And to answer your questions, how can we deal with it at the moment? I think we just need to investigate each and every case of labor right violation or anti-union action, unfair labor practice very meticulously and really bring it to the labor courts in the country, file a complaint at the national contact point under the OECD guidelines in the home country of the brand where this violation took place, or as a trade union, file a complaint to the Freedom of Association Committee on Freedom of Association at the ILO. I think these are, at the moment, the only avenues that we have to really deal with freedom of association violations. And just to answer your questions, obviously I agree brands need to make the changes and need to change their practices, but I think that we underestimate the power of consumers, because maybe not as an individual consumer, but we at the Clean Clothes campaign have seen that consumers, when they come together and put pressure on the brands, have actually achieved a lot and have achieved that brands compensate workers at supplier factories that closed down or that didn't pay them their wages or severance.
Yeah, I mean, I would agree. Consumers don't hold all the power. I don't think that's what we're saying, but we're also not powerless. We through some of the work that we've done, I mean, we've been pretty good at kind of galvanizing consumers to have place pressures on brands. And from speaking with some of these brands, we know that even if 100 of their customers ask them a question about a particular topic, they take that straight to the board and say, what are we going to do about this? Now they might do nothing, or they might do something, but that is influence there coming from consumers, even a small group. So let's not pretend that that consumers don't have agency and don't have power, because public cultural opinion has a massive influence on how brands operate, what they produce, how they sell things, what they market, the conversations that they're having with their customers, and we have to try and exercise that power. And just to jump on a couple other points, laws do matter, as we've talked a lot about today, but really it's governments need to do more to enforce. And I think that's perhaps something that the German government is working on. It's certainly conversations happening at the EU through the Garment Initiative. It's through the Modern Slavery Act in the UK. There's been a couple of cases, unfortunately not in the textile sector, in the food sector, where trafficking has been found and action has been able to take place, and we need more of these enforcement mechanisms. taxes is part of the equation, but we need more mechanisms to be able to exercise the laws that do exist through the courts and through the proper government channels, and that's where the government in Germany and the UK and EU can play a greater role. I'm just going to end quickly. We haven't talked a lot about climate change today. That's a very important part of this discussion as well. As you know, there's lots of issues in affecting the fashion industry, and we only have an hour and a half to talk about them. But it is, I do think that there is a sense of urgency happening, especially around the topic of circular economies, circular resources within the fashion industry, and brands, investing in technologies to kind of mitigate their climate change impacts. And that's it.
Great. I think we've come to the end of this panel, but probably not to the end of this debate. This is an important topic. I want to thank you all for participating. I would also like to give a big round of applause for the panelists.